Hello and welcome to the Welsh History Podcast. My name is Jonathan and I'm your host for this series. Let me begin by saying we're continuing with our discussions of the Bronze Age era, and today we're going to talk about a few specific instances and things that were found from an archaeological perspective while we're doing the Bronze Age. And of course, as we go into the Iron Age, we won't, as I've said before, have a lot of history to work from. There's no written record at this point, so we're almost purely reliant upon the wealth of material we've been able to find via archaeology. That's not a bad thing, though, to be fair, because there is some great stuff, especially recently, that have come about, which we are very, very blessed to have a hold of. And I think we're benefiting from the way it's showing us the way the world worked in Britain at this point in time. We're going to go outside of Wales for an example here today, just simply because it's so important to the Bronze Age discoveries that we've had. We'll talk a little bit about a number of different things, but how about we get to it? First of all, let's start talking about the Bronze Age more from the actual tools that they're using rather than the process of making bronze. One of the main things that's used for is to create, well, obviously farm implements, be it axes. We found tons of axes in the Bronze Age. There's obviously equipment for agriculture and digging pits, and also importantly, this is probably the first time we find evidence of actual proper weapons, not just like bow and arrow type ideas or things that could be weapons but they might not be. There is swords, and we find them in the Bronze Age for the first time in Britain. And the ones that we find the most of, I think, are in Scotland, but they have been found in other places, and certainly I think we will find them everywhere. The reality of it is there's a couple of factors to this, and one of the factors is a climactic factor. We have an incident where in the 1400s the weather starts to get colder. This forces people to move because, unpleasant weather means lousy growing season, means animals dying, means starvation, means. And so people, being the people that they are, realize they must move out of the mountain ranges and back into the valleys and back into the lowlands where the weather is more pleasant or less inclement, and that way they can continue with their lives. The only problem with this is, of course, this shift of what I would call climactic refugees creates a problem for the people that already live in the valleys, because they're there having their life, and all of a sudden these other people come on board, and maybe they're your family, maybe they're not. Maybe they're the local community, maybe they're not. And suddenly you have friction, you have confusion, you have warfare, you have problems of all sorts. And so this creates competition. And this competition will obviously create battles, it'll create bloodshed, it'll create prisoners. It creates a whole host of interesting problems that will come into this, and will start to reach this. And last week we talked a little bit about hill forts. Hill forts become sort of the way to live around this time and carry forward into the Iron Age, in part because of, as I said last week, the defensible nature of them, but also because they become an easy way to keep your community together. You can actually contain all of your animals in there. You could even put, some basic farm related growing in there. All your houses could be in there, and sometimes they're protected by an earth bank. Sometimes they're protected by ditches, and a lot of times there also been evidence of poles and wood that's been put in to sort of bulk up protection. And they get more complicated the closer we get to the Roman period, because of course people are thinking of ways of defending themselves, and so obviously as they have to make more preparations to prepare and protect themselves, the whole procession gets that much more complicated. The other derivative of all this is, and we have evidence of this at least in the later Iron Age, is that slaves get taken. Probably, and this is only a supposition, there's no evidence, full-on evidence of this. But the likelihood is that this comes out of battles, out of prisoners of war, out of taking communities. This happens a lot in the Middle East. If there's an invasion by one major empire into another, they'll capture citizens and drag them back into their own population, use them as slaves, use them as sex slaves, all sorts of different things to sort of basically use that population up. But more importantly, also to give a level of luxury to the population that's currently there, because of course slavery becomes a very cheap form of labor. I mean, it's the cheapest form in the fact that you're not actually paying for anything. But even in this time, you still have to feed them, so it's not a completely free service. But the thing of it is, you're concerned for their welfare is a whole lot less. Let's be honest, slaves are not treated well. That's part of the joy of being a slave. The other thing is you get the really, really crappy jobs, the awful stuff that nobody else wants to do. Hey, slave, guess what you get to do? You get to go into the mine and dig into a little tiny hole where you can barely breathe with maybe no light and chip away at a rock for 8 to 10 hours a day. And then we bring you out, maybe feed you, maybe not, wash, maybe not, a proper bed, probably not. Then you get to go back and do it all again the next day. And, that's kind of the lifestyle they would be leading. It would not be a fun one. But what this does, by creating this level of slavery, in all likelihood what happens is it also helps to create a stratification in society, because now the more slaves you have, the more wealth you acquire. So now it becomes in your interest to capture more slaves. So there's probably even more battles and more confrontations and more prisoners and more slavery of various types, because now it's an economic benefit to you. So again, this is something we've seen in other situations and in other civilizations throughout the Bronze, Iron, and into our modern age. This goes on. So as this is happening, as I said, it creates a stratification. The other thing that's going on is there's also a development which has happened probably a few hundred years before in the Middle East. Again, things are coming from the other parts of the world to Britain at this point. And one of the things that develops is the cart, and a wheeled cart at that. And so now all of a sudden you can stack things in a major amount into a cart. You can get an animal strapped to the cart. The other thing that we find at the beginning of 1000 BCE, largely in Britain, the horse has been domesticated and is now being used to move the carts along with the cattle and oxen. Another thing for the Welsh population, of course, is that in a lot of Wales, they are predominantly just into animal husbandry. There's a lot less agriculture. The reason for this, the evidence that we have, is found in the in the hill forts, both in the late Bronze and early and late Iron Age. There's a whole lot more consumption of animals than there is consumption of agriculture, simply because the storage facilities are not that big by comparison. And the amount of animals being eaten is quite large. So there also, I would argue, shows that there's been a change in climate where the agricultural side isn't quite as useful as it used to be. Now, as this happens, of course, like I said, you have these confrontations, but the other part is you have a stratification of society. And so one of the things that's come of that is a couple of archaeological finds that have happened. And one happened a long time ago. The other one happened relatively recently. And I think we'll talk about the recent one first. In Amesbury in Wiltshire, was a individual who was found. Actually, he was found, I believe there was two individuals, but there was one who was supremely better decked out than the other. Found in 2002. They were identified to be from the Bronze Age, and even though they were actually right near a Romano-British burial ground, which is an interesting thing as well. So here you have this combination of this Bronze Age burial along with a Romano-British one. You've got to think that there's a reason why those two are associated with each other, but who knows, right? It could be a complete accident as well. But unlikely, typically you'd think that these kind of grounds, the reason why they get reused is because there's a sense of ritualization of that. for whatever reason, right? Same reason why most cemeteries initially were built in church yards, because of the desire to build them near there in the Christian period, and all of that comes of that. Now, this person that was found was in their 30s or early 40s. They were buried in a style which becomes very popular in the Bronze Age, which is to be buried in the fetal position. This particular person was actually encased in a wooden coffin kind of thing, which is interesting and different than some of the other British burials that go on in this period. We'll talk about a couple of others, but to focus in on this, one of the things that was found with him was a massive amount of metal, and in the form of arrowheads, in the form of things that could produce bronze smelting. And as well, he was found with a layer of wealth, and a layer that has been not found in any burial site so far that we've found in the Bronze Age in Britain. So he's a massive find for the archaeological community. They're just getting to grips with all the details. I mean, some of the evidence that I found is as recent as 5 to 10 years ago. So they're still trying to understand. There were some associations with the idea that because Amesbury is not that far away from Stonehenge, that he has something to do with Stonehenge. Possibly. Stonehenge at this point is now a completed structure when he's found. The mid 2000, 1000 BCE, so like about 1500 BCE, which is close to when he's found. Now, the difference is that with Stonehenge at this point, we've come to the blue stones. It's gone from being an earth ditch to wooden posts to stones, and in fact, there is an argument that's contested by at least one archaeologist I found, that the stones, which I think the majority of archaeologists believe, were actually brought from Wales. So these stones that make up Stonehenge are blue stones. They're found in Wales. They were probably quarried in Wales and brought either by ship or by rolling to this part of Wiltshire, and that's the reason they're there. Why are the blue stones of Wales so important? Why are they such a religious monument? Unfortunately, we just don't know. We don't understand why they were so critical to be there. We also don't fully understand the reasons for that structure, as I've talked about a couple of episodes ago. It just is very important for some strange reason. Now, one of the things I do know is that Stonehenge is built on a type of a rise where it is seen from a fair distance. So and in some cases can be seen by hill forts that were relatively close. So that may be one of the reasons. So it's sort of a temple-like structure within the distance of a few communities. There is also evidence that there was a wooden henge not very far away. And the argument goes, and I think I've said this as well, that the wooden henge would be for the living, where the living would go to celebrate life, to have their life ceremonies, to do things like, when a birth has happened, you go to the wood henge. When a party is going on, you go to the wood henge. When you're celebrating the Midsummer's Eve, it's at Woodhenge. But then at Stonehenge, you do things that mark death. So then your burials happen there. Thus, you remember we brought up the fact that in the Neolithic period, there were burials there. As well, it's a place that you mark the end of the year and the beginning of the new, which happens at the winter solstice. So the concept of the changing seasons and the importance of God's rebirth, or God's rebirth, becomes important to that. We don't 100% know that. Of course, Stonehenge has been muddled with so many stories and so many ideas and so much confusion. The Romano-British thought it was built by giants. There's all sorts of weird and wonderful things and stories. And of course, our modern-day neo-pagan druids still use the site to kind of mark the solstice change. And the reality of it is, we don't even know if they're doing it right. We know that at one point, the stones fell down. They've been put up. Nobody's sure if they were ever put back up properly. So we don't even know if we've got what actually was Stonehenge in the shape it currently is now, or if this is just some guess of some Victorian person. And of course, that lends a whole passel of problems to it as well. So Stonehenge is a wonderful site. Unfortunately, it's a very confusing and befuddling site that is never really going to be solved unless we have a time machine, can go back and ask our ancient ancestors, probably speaking in a proto-Welsh, what the heck they were doing. And we won't ever know. So that's kind of the gist of Stonehenge. And the Amesbury Archer affiliation with him seems to show some sort of stratification, whether he was a king, whether he was just a specialist who was given a special reward. We don't know, but his burial is very unique. And so unique that there's only one other I can use in that period of time, which has a similar nature to it in the Bronze Age. And that actually is in a place called Mold, which is in Flintshire in North Wales, near Wrexham. This particular site, unfortunately, has the misfortune of being found in the early Victorian period. The reason why I say that's a problem is because this is before archaeology is a stratified science. There is not a lot of effort made to indicate what the stratification it was found in, the basics of archaeology, where you test things around it to kind of get to know roughly the age of it, carbon dating, all those kind of things. You can't do that with what they found. What did they find, you say? Well, they found what they call the Mold Cape. And it is made of gold. It is fantastic. It is an example of Bronze Age ingenuity and design. And I've left a link into pictures of it so you can see in the show notes. It is unbelievable. The in-depth quality of this is fascinating because you realize in this period, you're talking about the hinterland when it comes to civilization. There is no such thing as civilization as we would even remotely call it, or even compared to, say, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Assyrians. There's just nothing even remotely like that here. And yet somehow, in some way, a lady was buried with a cape top made of gold. And it literally, it looks like a flaming Shaw. And it's finely detailed with golden threading and stylistic decisions that just, it's a fantastic piece of ancient manipulation of metal. The fact that they did something that's on par with the pharaohs is an amazing achievement. And it is definitely that. So how was it found? Well, in 1833, some workers, and nobody really knows for sure whether they were digging a gravel pit or possibly quarrying some stone, they lifted a stone and found a burial site. And there's where the problem lies. The stone they lifted was obviously a cairn. It was obviously a megalith. They lifted it off of the burial site. And we do know that she's a woman who was buried with that, was also buried with amber beads, and there was also some sort of cremation urns with her. A lot of that, unfortunately, got lost. The workers were told by their manager to toss the cape into a bush, I kid you not, and basically to give it to the manager at the end of the day, which they then did. They lost bits and pieces in the process because, of course, the cape wasn't in one piece. It was in three, plus little bits and pieces in the gravesite. When he finally got it and then gave it to the British Museum, British Museum comes along. They try and find other parts. They find some of it, but not all of it, and they bring it back. And, of course, for the next, let's say, 100 years almost, they don't actually know what they've got. They think it's all sorts of things. They think it's like something that was used as sort of a shield type thing, possibly like an armor, be it ceremonial or whatever. Then it was like thought to be something for a horse. And of course, none of that turned out to be the case because at some point, somebody in the early 1900s decided to sit down, work through it, and figure out exactly what it was. And that's when they realized it was actually a cape. Actually, that she was buried with a woman who obviously was a woman of power. Because, don't bury somebody with that amount of gold who isn't powerful. She had a place of honor in society. Because, one, they buried her with honorable things. Two, much like every other Bronze Age find that we have, Bronze Age people are generally buried with objects. and objects of importance, typically to them. We find all sorts of evidence, even going into the Iron Age and into the Roman period, of people being buried with combs, with brooches, with all sorts of interesting things that were important to them, probably in that life. And these are just some of the things that we find. And the more opulent they are, obviously, the likelihood is the better off that person was. And when we're talking a gold cape of that magnificence, yeah, we're probably talking this person may have been a local king, effectively, or in this case, a queen, or maybe a consort to somebody who was, and was beloved enough that nobody basically went in and rifled through her tomb when they actually knew it was in there. Because later on, of course, people forget about it, it gets buried. You know, it's not like Egypt where you have these massive works of stone that sit above these opulent burials. So there isn't an obvious place for people to go finding and digging and grave robbing, although they do. And so we got lucky in this case, and we do get lucky archaeologically when we find these things. This is certainly nothing that normally gets found, and in Britain's case has never been found in the Bronze Age. So it's an amazing discovery. These two discoveries are probably the most interesting, fascinating discoveries, and of course one of them is in Wales, and they show that society is stratified, that there is a level to it, that there's luxury for some, that there's leisure time for some. And as we go into things next time, because we're going to continue to talk about all this, one of the things that we have to talk about as we transition into the Iron Age is the idea that now we're starting to get to a point where myth is being made, where ritual can be done. Because now you have a stratification. Well, one of the things that we get when we have stratification is a priest class. And priest classes need reasons to exist. And one of the things that they do to exist is to have a mythology, to create a reason for them to be as powerful as they are. And we can debate and discuss what that means, but the reality of it is that priests are, be it through belief or whatever, are going to make sure that there's a significance to what they're doing. And certainly we get this, and it will transition into the Iron Age into what we call druids. But at this point, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about possibly shamanic types, possibly people who are considered in the old biblical term of a prophet. There might be a high priest type person, but we have to remember these groups are not stratified. Even though they're stratified, they're not a civilization yet. They're not in a situation where you have hundreds of thousands of people living in a community, or even tens of thousands of people. You're probably talking, most communities are a village size or less. If they're that, and typically they're made up of the local family, the local community, and they're very subsistence based. They're very much built around the agricultural ability to survive. And even as we get to the point where there's trade obviously coming around, which again in the Bronze Age we do get, one of the other developments of the Bronze Age is these boats that are found, or have been found, which they are massive boats with 18 people rowing in them. So effectively they're a lot like the Viking ships in the size of them. So you could transport major amounts of goods in these things, especially when you have pottery, because of course you can store it in the pottery. Which is why when there's ships that go down and get sunk in the ancient times, we do find pottery in them. Very common things that are found in the Roman era, for example, is to find massive urns with anything from olive oil to wine to precious goods to ballast to and the list goes on and on and on. This is the same sort of thing even in the Bronze Age. There's people traveling from across the seas to each other, be it from Wales to Ireland, be it from Scotland to the Orkneys and the other islands around them, be it from what we now call England to France, what we would call France. All of this is probably going on during this period of time, and we're probably having an exchange of populations in that period of time. And in likelihood is that the languages are relatively close enough that you can make trades with people and understand them, because you still don't have written languages. At this stage, in this part of Europe, there just is nothing written down. So unfortunately, we're in other places like Syria and Assyria, like the Levant, and in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, we have written notifications of things. We have tablets that give us all sorts of information. We have stories. We have all sorts of... We don't have any of that here still. And that won't exist until the Romans arrive, which is so disappointing in a way, because it would be a wonderful thing to have that written record to be able to go to as a historian and say, oh, hey, we have this too. Because the reality of it is history and archaeology do actually bounce off one another good, and sometimes they bounce off one another badly. And so it's good to have those comparisons, because then you can say, hey, what is the middle ground on this? What is really going on here? When you don't have that, you have to rely on archaeology. That's what we're doing mostly in this Bronze and Iron Age. We're desperately reliant on the archaeological evidence and what it gives us. And thankfully, we're getting good archaeological evidence at this point. We're finding out about people. We're finding out about some of the basic things that people are doing. And more to the point, we're finding out the good side and the bad side of the Bronze Age for people. Because as much as it's good for some, it is definitely bad for others. And to put a point to this, when we talk about the Amesbury man, one of the interesting parts of that particular individual is the fact that his knee bones are gone on the one knee. So basically, he probably walked with at least a limp for whenever this happened till the end of his life, and it probably contributed to killing him. So that's the good and the bad, because of course we don't have what we would call medicine. There's probably very little in the way of being able to heal people. I'm sure they understood basic things. There was a form of dentistry that was done, although it sounds really scary in some places, and there was some form of medicine that was done in these time periods, but nothing compared to anything that would be modern. And obviously your life expectancy dropped considerably if you got wounded, injured, or broke a limb. So even for the wealthy, nothing was ever guaranteed in this era. And of course, as we go through this era, we have these massive sea changes of people moving in and out because of various climactic problems. And whenever that happens, that has a tendency to blow your stratification quite quickly, because once those confrontations happen, people get killed. And I'm sure that's what's going on in some of these cases, especially when you see things like drastic environmental change, where there's cold, which means less growing season, less ability to stay up in the mountains or in the hilly regions, and thus there's a combination of people. And every time you have too many people putting pressure, then we have these combinations of problems which all explode at once. Then you build swords and you go to war, and you take your land and you take your prisoners and make them slaves and put them to work on your lands, and then you benefit from it until such time as somebody says, hey, that's enough of that, and we go through this whole process again, as we do in history. And so I think that's where we're going to leave this for today. I will say that there's some fascinating stuff that are being put into the show notes. Please go have a look at some of the links. Definitely you will be curious to see the Mold Cape and the Amesbury Archer. I think those are fascinating to look at because they're both solid images. We also have maps on the site, on the Podbean site. So if you go to welshhistorypodcast.podbean.com, you can actually go and you'll notice that I have links set out. I'm actually putting the resources into a separate folder, as well as with each episode, so that you can go through and have a look at them. I also have put up some of the maps that I've been finding around, things like links to them anyway, to the Ice Age, to the Neolithic, to the Roman era. As I find them, as we get closer to talking about them, I'll put more and more up, so you can kind of gives you an idea of what the territory might have looked like. As well, I'll be putting up some personal photos I've taken. I actually went to the Welsh Museum of Life, which is kind of a natural, or not natural museum, but a museum in the outdoors where you go and you can visit buildings. And they've got buildings from across Wales, which they brought into this museum area. And you can wander in them and kind of see what life was like at various points in the Welsh lifestyle. One of the things that's fascinating is the actual roundhouses. And as we enter the Iron Age, I'm going to put up a video link probably on the Facebook page, and then I'll link it back to the Podbean page, which actually shows me walking into one of these and how dark and how dank and how much smoke there would have been in that era. And it was interesting to kind of experience that. My voiceover, I admit, is terrible. Please bear with me on that. But I think it's fascinating to kind of have a look at. So I hope you'll have a look at it. I hope you're curious about it. It's fascinating stuff. And as I say always, if you have any concerns, comments, want to give me some sort of lecture about something, or if you have links to articles or things that you think would be interesting for me to look at, send them to the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And I'm on Twitter at JohnDMP. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.
This has been a Distractions Media production. For more information, you can check out everything we do at distractionsmedia.com.